By way of introduction, my name is Colin Minchin. I'm a local CMC consultant and very pleased to be moderating this panel for you all. So, when outsourcing in the pharma industry, or indeed any industry, all parties work to the utmost degree to ensure that things go well. Invariably, something happens and things do go wrong. Sometimes technical or timing issues, sometimes quality issues, and sometimes relationship challenges. And we also deal with, how we deal with these things that go wrong is crucial to the success of the partnership, and more importantly, to the success of the program. MassBio has assembled this panel to provide what will be a very biased discussion on these points. Biased because this is only one side of the picture. Arguably the most important side, that of the voice of the customer. In this case, the panel represents CMC, that is the manufacturing, the development of the drug substance or the API or of the product. And these are the customers for those sort of CDMOs, the CDMO space. So in this session, we're going to briefly introduce ourselves. We're going to discuss what it takes to make things go right. We'll share situations where things clearly went wrong. And importantly, what happened, what did we do about it, and what are the learnings? And we also plan to open up the session so that we can engage in dialogue. So what I'd like to do is introduce all four of the panelists up to join me on the stage, and in a few moments we'll introduce themselves. So I'll introduce Akash Jain, who is Director of Program Leadership at Spero Therapeutics. Padma Narayan, who is Director of Formulation Development and Tech Ops at Sage Therapeutics. Dan Kuto, who is the Chief Technical Officer at Vedanta. And Trish Herter, who is the Senior Vice President of Pharmaceutical and Preclinical Services at Vertex. If you can give them a round of applause, please. So I've asked all my panelists to just briefly introduce themselves, and I'll start at the other end there. Akash.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. My name is Akash Jain. I'm a Director of Program Leadership at Spero Therapeutics. Have been at the company for about 2.5 years, and my background is in formulations, drug product development on the early phase. And then currently, my role is program leadership and leading our antibiotic candidate that is moving very quickly from early to late phase development. So very nice to be here and look forward to the dialogue today.
Thank you. Padma.
Hello, everyone. My name is Padma Narayan. I'm Director of Formulations at Sage Therapeutics. My role is focusing on the early phase to registration for small molecules in the neuroscience area. I have a background in chemical engineering and drug product solid oral technology. I've been in industry for about 20 years, both in the specialty chemical and in the pharmaceutical industries. So I'm really happy to be here to share all the knowledge and best practices of working and building relationships with our CDMOs.
Thank you, Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Kudo. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Vedanta Biosciences. I've been in the industry for a little over 25 years at a number of different biotech companies and big pharma, as well as manufacturing organizations. Most of the biotech companies I've been at were of a virtual model where we had to use third parties quite a bit for not just drug substance, but drug product, as well as having the need to do other type of third-party work like specialty formulation or clinical distribution for supply chain. But most of my background is all biologics. The Vedanta Biosciences is a kind of an outlier. It's a microbiome company where we manufacture all the stuff in-house, so we don't work with third parties as much.
Thank you, Dan. Trish.
Hi, I'm Trish Herter, and I've been at Vertex Pharmaceuticals here in the Boston area for the last 14 years. Prior to that, I was at Merck. And I guess I joined Vertex at an interesting time when they were just transitioning from being kind of a research phase company that had the odd drugs that weren't doing so well to really taking off. And also have brought 4 breakthrough therapies to the market in the last 6 years, 6 or 7 years, and we have a 5th that we're hoping to file next year. We started off being mostly virtual, and now we do kind of an even mix. So for example, right now our OpEx budget for these kinds of activities is about 200 million. About half of that is internal, about half of that is external. So we get to see sort of both sides of the coin. And needless to say, I've worked with many CMOs and many, many great relationships, and some that were just so-so. So it'd be interesting to talk about those.
Thank you. So I think I've alluded to the fact that we're going to talk about things that go right, or how to make sure that things go right. And I'll turn to Trish with the question, what does it take to ensure things go well when working with a service provider?
So I think there's probably the 3 things that I think are most important. So one is communication. You need to have really great communication. And I think on the customer side, sometimes we have a tendency to want to only tell CMOs what we think they need to know. And for example, if we know that we're getting data in February and we had this batch scheduled for March but might cancel it, we usually wouldn't tell the CMO that because we wouldn't want them to feel less compelled to do our project. But I think that doesn't lead to a good relationship and partnership. And everybody knows in the pharmaceutical industry that you get data and then you go on to the next step. So I think it's better to share that kind of information so that you can both plan around that and understand contingencies and things like that. I'd say the second thing is really trying to make the people at the CMO and your company feel like they're one team. And ways to do that is to get the people at the CMO just as excited about the drug that you're working on as you are within your own company. Share clinical data with them, share plans, so that everybody at the CMO can be really engaged in, for example, in our case, trying to cure cystic fibrosis is certainly quite compelling, and it makes people want to work a little harder and try a little more. And then I think the third thing, what was the third thing? There was a third one. I forgot. It's got to be 2 for now, sorry. There was a third one, but
That'll do.
it's late.
We'll pass it on to Dan.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I would add to your list has to do with a structure of communication. So communication in general is good, but to be able to clearly define the roles and responsibilities on both sides of the relationship is important. I've seen different structures for program management that are good and different ones that are not good. What you want to be able to do is put a structure in that minimizes confusion and minimizes miscommunications, and do that right up front and make sure that you stay to it.
Yeah, adding on to both Trish and Dan, the other thing is prioritization. One of the things to have a healthy relationship is to help and actually help involve your vendor partner with prioritization of activities. As one of the items is sometimes we have a lot of scope creep, and sometimes it's unannounced. You don't really anticipate, and especially when you're in research and development, there are a lot of items that can occur, and a lot of serendipitous things that can occur as well. So helping having a common understanding, good project management, helping to prioritize those items that are key for the business to achieve those milestones is really important, and involving our partners and understanding why those milestones are important so that they can have an infrastructure that works with us.
One additional point is maybe I shouldn't talk. The one additional point I want to add is to start the process early of getting to know your CMOs or CDMOs and being a little more proactive in identifying the right fit for you and your project. I think sometimes you wake up, you want something get done in a very tight timeline, and then that's too late to start the process and make things go well. So I think starting early, doing a good due diligence, learning about their people and the capabilities, their equipment trains, things like that. I think just getting a step ahead helps a lot.
Thank you. Well, I can add to this in that one thing I omitted to say before, I've been in both CDMOs as well as on the buy side. And I was many years in Patheon, a company that is now one of the biggest CDMOs in the world. And it's really obvious that one of the most important things is the relationship side and getting to a level of trust. You have to trust each other. If you don't have trust, then the whole thing breaks down. And I've seen teams where they lose trust. And that's when senior management has to get involved, because you've got to bring the trust back. I don't trust the data because I don't trust that scientist anymore. That's an absolute recipe for disaster. So to me, the relationship side is probably the most critical part. Processes for escalation of issues, etc. But if it haven't got fundamental trust, and you start off with a premise of trust, but then it has to be built on to be proven, and it doesn't take much to lose it. Either way, more likely the customer will lose trust with the provider, but sometimes it's the other way around at times where, you know, if they're not being open and honest with me, how do I know that I'm still going to be working for them in next week because they're going to kill the compound? So there is that. Thank you. So let's talk about things that might go wrong. Perhaps whoever wants to volunteer to go first. An example of something that went wrong, let's anonymize this, something that went wrong in a situation with a supplier, but they dealt with it in a good way. So at the end, there was a good outcome.
Sure, I got one. So this is actually something that went wrong. It had nothing to do with the control of the CMO. We went forward, we manufactured material for a clinical study, and we conducted the clinical study, and the study didn't pan out the way we expected. And we had already started to manufacture for the next study. And we were running out of money, and we needed to work out some type of deal that kept us rolling, but did not bankrupt us. So we got into a level of negotiating that would only been possible if the two parties really felt like they were in partnership as opposed to just fee for service. And that took a lot of time to build up to that, but we took advantage of the position we were in and worked out a payment plan that made them satisfied and kept us rolling. And then we got out of our problem, and we got off a clinical hold, and we got back on track, and we get moving. And because they were able to help us in this way, we became loyal, which is the other thing that happens to this CMO for the next 2 or 3 programs that we brought forward. So this is an example of a lot of work that leads up to a partnership kind of a status, which goes both ways. And it's not always the CMO screws up something technical. I have plenty of those stories too. But in the same vein, that sword cuts both ways, right? So.
Anyone else?
Sure, I can volunteer. This is with regards to the amount of API that we had planned to work with the scope of a project. So what happened was when the API was delivered to a certain manufacturer, they found that we weren't sure how the object came into it, but obviously there was an object inside the API drum. So unfortunately, we were at the constraint of working with almost 1/10 of the API that we had planned for. So that caused a little bit of conflict within the project management and as well as the SMEs, because the SMEs at the facility had larger scale equipment. So all the experiments were planned at larger scale. So it really took there was a lot of frustration, but at the end of the day, we all worked together to find a way to scale down the process to where we could work with 1/10 of API. But overall, yes, I would say there was a lot of worry about being able to order equipment that was suitable for that. So we had to actually delay the program for about 3 months because we had to get special equipment that would fit to that scale. But there was a lot of communication and a lot of crosstalk that allowed us to get those resources in. And again, it was both the internal company that I was working for as well as the CDMO to go to their leadership to ask for more time, more resources, and the ability to work with a more creative solution. So I would say innovation is another thing which I really stress, in that ability to innovate both from the CDMO side as well as the client side.
Thank you. Akash?
Yeah, so one example is we're working on an early phase formulation development and manufacturing for an early phase study, and because of the nature of the API, we had to actually work with the CRO to get that dedicated equipment in place. In this case, it was a tablet press, and it turns out we're moving from a single, punch to a rotary press. And at the very last minute, the new equipment did not perform the way it was supposed to. And then we had it wasn't a crisis, but the situation was, it was going to impact the time it's going to take to produce the material and have it delivered to the clinical site. And the way we resolved was, again, working with the CRO to understand what it would take if we still worked with that single punch press that was used for the development work, and how they could, add more resources to actually work through that workflow with a single press versus. So again, we were able to work with the schedule and get it all done, but I think it required flexibility on both sides and really understanding what the issue is.
So far, these have all been examples where something went wrong technically, clinical study, it didn't pan out, something happened with the API, so it wasn't this CDMO's fault, but they helped you deal with it. And similarly, another case where something didn't go as expected and they helped you out of that situation. Trish, do you have any examples that ultimately ended up well?
So I guess I had the sort of tale of two CMOs that run at the same time, and this was VX950, which was in CVIC, the first drug that Vertex brought to market by themselves. And we had, in fairly close proximity, two situations where API wasn't available at the next step in the process, the next CMO on time. In one case, the stuff was supposed to leave UK by Friday afternoon at whatever time, and arrive at the next country by 5 p.m. on Friday, and the plane had some technical error and the plane didn't take off. And we're like, oh my goodness, now what? And so the CMO that we're working with on that particular project, the receiving CMO, was one we had a really good relationship with, and the stuff eventually ended up arriving on Sunday morning, and they still were able to be there in the plant on Sunday morning and do what they should have done earlier in the week and start the manufacture on time, keep everything on schedule. In a very similar time frame, we had a similar thing where in the US, some API was supposed to arrive by 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and it was going to be 20 minutes late. And this particular CMO was not exactly my favorite CMO, and we really didn't have a great relationship with them, and their project manager was not the nicest person. I don't know what his problem was, but anyway, and so basically he said, if it's not here at 5 o'clock, tough luck, you lose your slot for next week. And the stuff didn't get there at 5 o'clock, so it was there at 5:20. So it's just amazing, like the difference, in terms of customer service. And needless to say, the CMO that did it, even though it arrived 2 days late, we still do a lot of work with them. And the one that, 20 minutes late was too late for them, we don't, So I think the attitude of the CMO, and particularly the person that's the sort of the interface, which I think that project manager role is really, really huge in terms of facilitating, internal people and external people and kind of getting everybody on the same page. So.
And I have an example of one where I was working with two companies, and company A was the manufacturer and company B was the clinical packager. Clinical packager was packaging and found 2 empty vials in the received materials, which had passed every QC test and quality assurance test under the sun. So, you still need to keep the program going. You've got to go back to the manufacturer. You can go play the blame game. Yeah, they screwed up. The 2 empty vials has to come out of their shop. But we still need to keep this program going. So we're negotiating with them, negotiating with QPs in Europe. QPs are the people who release the product for clinical study in Europe, and came up with a plan to look for the data, and if the data played out in a certain way, then the project could stay going without several more inspections. And the manufacturing company put an A team of quality assurance people on it to go through all the documentation, and within 24 hours had come up with all the data that played out the way we needed it to keep the program going. These guys were working what seemed to be 24 hours on the weekend, the same as you. The company knew it had screwed up, and it decided the only way out of this was to make sure that at the end of the day, they supplied us with everything we needed. And it worked. And I'm a consultant, and I'm still sending RFPs to this company to enable them to bid on future projects. If it hadn't played out that way, there's absolutely no way I'd have gone back to them. So the customer experience, I think somebody spoke to earlier, I think Syed from the opening ceremony, it's so important because things will happen. So now let's turn to things that went wrong. And I know, Trish, you've alluded to this in something, where the outcome wasn't good, and therefore you had learnings from it, and then you could play on them. So any volunteers to go first on this one?
Yes, so I have one, sure. We were manufacturing our validation batches for a very large product that we were going to be filing our BLA and commercializing. And after we did all of these batches and spent a ton of money, we found that in one of the batches there was a foreign object that I don't know how it got in there, but it was in there. And this is in the drug substance as opposed to the drug product. So this is very odd that it would be getting into this. You know, we went forward and we tried to do a risk assessment to see what the impact would have been. We went through the normal root cause analysis for the deviation. And we ended up with a plan that we worked through with the CMO. And we added additional testing for any of the materials of construction that would have been in that thing. And we basically showed that there was absolutely zero impact into this. And then after doing all this work, and it took about 6 months to do, and a lot of effort, we got together and we decided that even after doing all that, we could not use the material because it would be a sign to the agency that we were willing to accept most anything. And maintaining our relationship, for example, with the agency was more important than the $20 or $30 million that we spent on this material. So even though we worked together and did the right thing, the outcome was not a good thing. And as a result, we didn't go forward with that product and commercializing the product.
In hindsight, could that decision have been made earlier? Why was the decision delayed to cause the X million dollars of work to then still make the decision to pull it?
So the additional, it was gathering information. We weren't right away at the point. We wanted to gather more information, and even with everything on the table, we still made that decision that way for a different reason. It was unfortunate because I believe that the product was a good one and that the people did all the right things, and stuff happens when you manufacture and you need to have a good thing. But I think this points towards there's something more than the technical understanding and something more than the processes that we put in place with our quality systems that need to be accounted for. There are other things that cause you to make decisions that are outside of those realms. That
Were you in a smaller company at the time or a large pharma?
so 250 people.
Okay,
so smaller company.
Smaller company, and 30 million is an enormous amount.
It is,
for a
absolutely.
small company.
Yeah.
So I think, to me, that's one of the challenges in working. If you're in a smaller company, you have immature systems,
Yeah.
and in this case, an immature system that potentially delayed a decision because you needed to collect that data.
I would say maybe, but I wouldn't say that it was a immature system that caused the systems that we were leveraging off of were of the CMOs, which was a large organization.
Okay.
Our decision making had more to do with the amount of information we feel we needed to make that decision.
I have
Trish?
a pretty sad story, so, you know.
Go ahead.
So, you know, normally when you're picking a CMO, you can normally get, you know, good price, high speed, or good quality. You can get maybe 2 out of 3, you know. It's very seldom you can get 3 out of 3.
Sure.
If you get 0 out of 3, then you're really kind of, it's pretty sad.
That's a bad day.
It's a really bad day, yeah. So anyway, so we had our first biologic product, and we didn't know very much about biologics. And so we were kind of back to being the virtual company we used to be because we didn't have really any internal capability to do anything. And so because of that, we went to an incredibly reputable company that manufactures biologics, and we're prepared to pay a lot of money to get this very reputable company who clearly had a lot of expertise to manufacture this for us. And it was just horrifying. I mean, the most rotten job I've ever come across in my entire life. They should have been able to make all the stuff we needed in 2 batches. I think they took 6 because they kept on failing batches. they were supposed to, the analytical methods were sort of phase 1 type methods when we brought in the product, and we were manufacturing the pivotal material, so we really need the analytical methods upgraded. They were supposed to do that, but they said no, they didn't have the resources and they didn't have the time, they just couldn't do it. So we ended up we found out that we actually did have some biologics people in our organization we didn't even know about, and so we ended up using them, and they came up with better methods. And then, of course, Vertex was started with protein stuff, and so we had all these protein people actually in the research side of the organization, so they helped us out, and so they did a lot of development stuff. So between the research protein people and the people we didn't know who knew about biological analytical method development, we were able to kind of figure something out. And then we moved from this incredibly expensive, incredibly awful CMO that I will never go to ever again as long as I live, to a different CMO that, is actually in Germany, and so they're, very methodical, and so they're not fast. Their prices were pretty reasonable, and they do a fantastic job. And we were able to make, with the previous company, I think we made 10 grams in 6 batches for I don't remember how many $1 million. And with the second company, we were able to make, with the improved process that had been developed primarily in-house with our lack of expertise, we're able to make something like 30 grams in 1 batch for significantly less money. So, but I think the thing is, I think one of the reasons why this very reputable, very large company didn't give us their A-team at all, because they felt like this was a very small product and they weren't very excited about it. But I think the knock-on effect of that is, again, wherever I go, as long as I live, I will never, ever, ever take a project to that company ever again. And in Vertex as a company, maybe this is a very small biologic project, but we do a bunch of other things as well. And again, whether it's gene therapy, something we're going into now, or small molecules or biologics, I sincerely doubt that Vertex will ever, ever, ever take any project to the CMO ever again.
So if that CMO, if that CMO was bought by somebody else,
we still wouldn't go there.
Does that tar the bigger company,
and
you'd never work with a bigger company?
All the children that they ever acquired, everything. Anybody who touches them, yes.
Pox on their family.
Pox on their family, yeah. I mean,
Are we learning that we shouldn't be upsetting Trish?
It's funny because what you point out makes me think about how important the CMO selection process is in the first place.
Right.
It's no different than the analogy is for hiring the right people into your company. You go through interviewing process and you're looking for certain types of things, and at the end of the day, it pays to be able to make sure that your criteria for selection is robust enough and it ties into what you truly care about. Most people default to technical aspects, but 9 times out of 10, what fails in these types of things isn't technical, it's some soft skill that didn't work very well and could have saved your project or not because of the personalities or the people that are involved. So it may be cliched, but it boils back down to the right people in a lot of cases.
I agree. I agree with the caveat that any selection process, however sophisticated, is still risk mitigation. There's no perfect hiring of an individual from interviews.
Good.
There's no perfect selection of a CDMO. At the end of the day, you're mitigating risk, trying to make it the best you can, and then you're still going to make a go of it. And even a good one can screw up badly.
Right, but one thing that I heard from you is that there was a big CMO, right? A big company.
Well, it's a company with many different sites. I mean, this particular site was, very much focused on this particular thing that we were trying to do, and it wasn't a particularly huge site, and the people did actually seem to be, when we went over there, decent. They disappointed us.
So a lot of times I've found that that I've gotten great customer service out of mid-size or smaller CMOs.
I agree.
That are specialty because they care more about your business. You're not just, you're not going to give me this amount of business overall, so therefore I'm not going to give you the A team.
Right.
Every team that they give you, it's like their last meal. They need to do a great job, right?
I think that also, for example, staying away from naming individual CMOs, but in a certain, like in some countries, maybe working for that CMO is like really fantastic job, and so you're going to get the best quality people in that country. Whereas, for example, maybe in another country, it's more interesting to go work for, your company or my company or something, and maybe you wouldn't get as good talent. So I think some of that is like, and then for example, if it's a family-run company or it was family, was founded by a family, and it's really got a really strong core value, and everybody in the company knows what they're trying to do, and it's just that very loyal kind of employees. I think that often, helps a lot as well. And you often find that in this, to your point, the smaller to mid-sized CMOs, the really, really big ones that are constantly getting bought out and acquired and changing their senior management and everything else. You have a lot less loyalty of the employees, and often if you don't have those loyal employees, then often you don't get as good service.
What's the name what's it rhyme with?
Moving on. Padma?
Well, to add to a positive example, one of the experiences I had working for a big pharma was to actually buy FTEs or partner FTEs in that CDMO organization. This organization was outside of the US as well, and we actually interviewed people. So it came from the partnership from leadership down. So the leadership basically had a good relationship between our company and the CDMO, and they actually allowed all the SMEs to interview the key SMEs candidates for that other company, and then we actually had those FTEs for about 2 years. So that was a good way that we kind of built that efficiency. But I'm going to talk about a drastic example, actually. This involves a breach of contract. So this is totally outside of pharma. This is when I was working in chemicals. We were partnering with a small company that helped us develop agricultural formulations. And so we worked with them for a while. They had a really good understanding of the excipients and the adjuvants, they call them, to make herbicides and pesticide formulations. So, and of course, obviously you have a CDA in place with your MSAs, et cetera. So what happened was we realized later that a patent application came up with our formulation in it, and we were never told. And we were not co-authors on the application as well. So when we found, our legal group actually found the application that was published, and then there was a big litigation between our companies to basically rescind the patent application. So it was quite a nasty, and of course we're now working with that unknown company again.
Yes.
Okay, so I think you've got one up on Trish. Akash?
Yeah, so the example I would like to share is this was during the early days at Spiro when they were just trying to get their very first product into a phase 1 study. It was a parenteral peptide CMC project, and the company engaged with a CMO which had end-to-end capabilities to do both API and then the purification of the peptide and then the drug product side of things. And so that was great. That was what Spiro needed, or a company like Spiro needed at the time. As we were working with them, I think a couple of things that really drove us crazy was, number one, every time there was a need to change some of the scope, for example, there were problems with purification and yields of that API. And then every time there was a scope change, that cost a lot of additional cost implications for Spiro, and there was very little flexibility to work around something which none of the two parties anticipated running into. And then the second was around documentation, and as we were putting our package together for regulatory filings, the underlying reports, and getting those ready and available. And what was happening was, again, this was a CMO spread across different sites in different countries, and the communication was just not helpful. And it took months to get reports in the right folder and the right format, and things which we could use to file our product application. So now we have a second generation product or a molecule, and yes, we're of course working with different partners now.
So I think a theme here is just, if you screw up, if there's a problem and you deal with it well, you have the potential to continue. If there's a problem and you deal with it badly, then you're going to lose business in the long term. You're going to lose loyalty. Before I ask any other questions of the panel, does anyone have anything they'd like to add to this? Does anyone have any other interesting or fun examples of things that went wrong and were solved well, and things that went wrong and you've never worked with somebody again? There are microphones. If you'd like to put your hands up, if there's anybody who'd like to share anything, you can anonymize it. You don't have to. I mean, Trish has done this nicely. I'm going to be paying her later to find out who that CMO was. Is there anything you'd like to add?
So while they're all thinking, I did eventually remember my third thing.
Oh, please go ahead with your third thing while they're thinking.
So the third thing is kind of a weird one, and it's like, not that weird, but it's the importance of giving clear feedback in both directions. So, for example, people in my organization, sometimes they say, well, there was this one CMO we found that was, it's in fact not even a CMO, it's a place that does development. And it's very hard to find places that have, their focus is actually doing scientific development as opposed to just manufacturing. And so I was pretty excited when we found this place, and the CEO seemed like a really smart guy and everything else. It's like, well, great, because we need more capacity in actual just development scientists. This will be a good match. And so they gave them some projects to do, and then I said, well, how did it go? And they said, well, they were really good at executing, but that was it. So if you told them exactly what to do within very narrowly confined parameters, and then they would do it, and that was great. But there was nothing beyond that, which doesn't sound great at all. It doesn't sound like, PhD chemical engineers, which is what these people were. And I was like, well, did you give them that feedback? And they're like, yeah. I was like, okay, fine. So then met with the CEO guy, and I was like, we're talking about what was going well and whatever. And I said, I was just curious, did anyone give you this feedback that it seems like what our guys felt was that you were just working within narrowly confined parameters and doing exactly what they said? And I mean, the guy was horrified. He was completely horrified. He's like, no one ever gave us that feedback, and that's not what we do, and everything else. And they had a completely different perception. And so I think sometimes in cases like that, if you don't actually tell the people what your perception is, and the thing is, I think what was probably happening is they probably looked at our experimental designs and said, okay, well, this is what they want us to do, we'll do that, and felt maybe because we were the customer that they couldn't say, well, we think that's maybe not the best idea, maybe you should do this instead. And so they felt constrained, I think, to do exactly what we said, as opposed to, us having given them that feedback that there actually was some flexibility, and we would like them to actually engage and give us their ideas and everything else. So, and then the other thing, of course, is like sometimes when we, Vertex, work with a company, there might be things within Vertex that different parts of our organization are doing that's making it really, really hard for the CMO to deliver. And so maybe our quality organization is being too demanding, or maybe our legal organization is taking too long on the contracts, or maybe our accounts payable is not actually paying the bills and there's a cash flow problem. And if we don't know what those problems are, we can't solve them. So I think, of course, we could always say, well, we don't care. That's a possibility. But the chances are, if we want to have a good relationship with the CMO, that we want to fix those problems too. So I think the CMO should both tell us, what's making it difficult to give us good service, as well as us telling them what our perceptions are working with them, and then hopefully both sides can work to improve and make it a better relationship. So.
I would agree with that. My example of something that went wrong and should have been handled better by the CMO was we had a regulatory authority ask us a question, and that question involved a very small piece of analytical work to be done at the CMO. And it was a quick discussion on the phone. Yes, we'll do that. It'll cost you a few $100. And the analyst said, I'll have the data by Thursday. So and when you get a question from a regulatory authority, normally there's a clock ticking on it. You've got to respond by a certain date, or I don't know what happens. I've never known what happens because I've always been told you respond by a certain date, and everybody throws their resources at it. Anyway, come Thursday, no data. So Thursday at close of business, I phoned the project manager who gets hold of the analyst. The analyst had meant that they would have finished the chromatography by Thursday night, and there was still 8 hours or a few more hours of data analysis in the report. So the analyst had told us what she would have finished, but that had set an expectation. And the problem with setting that expectation, that had now been communicated to the executive of this small company, including the CEO. So there was an expectation that we'd be responding to the regulators by Friday. So long story short, a phone call to the vice president of the CMO got it solved. But that, to me, is one of the biggest issues in the relationship, is expectation setting. That expectation had been set by a fairly junior analyst on the phone. Nobody had corrected them to say on the phone that, you're not going to get the data till Monday or whatever, which, by the way, would have been acceptable. But that expectation had been set. It had gone up the chain in the client company. And now you've got the CEO of a client company knowing what a CDMO in CMC is doing, when most times you just do not want the CEO to be aware of the product side. So that, to me, was communication and expectation setting. In fact, that's one of the priorities I think should exist in the CDMO. You set our expectations. We tell you what we need. You tell us what we can get in an appropriate way, and then we'll all work to that. If we're being unreasonable, you will deliver this data by X. We need to know, because as much as it's unpalatable at any time, it's worst after it's too late.
It's funny you talk about that, because there's many examples that you can probably point to that gets to how people communicate. And being able, and for me it boils down to the selection process again, because you can't get 100%, but if you're observant enough and you're going through, you've narrowed down your selection to 2 or 3 CMOs, and now you're making visits to meet them. Meeting them is so crucial, and it's not you're going there to see what their equipment is, or how their lab is laid out, or what their capacity is. You're going there to meet individuals and observing how they communicate, even in these introductory meetings, and making sure that you actually take the time to talk to people that are going to be doing the work, as opposed to the senior leadership team that meets you in the meeting. Because even though the senior leadership team may very well be there in the meeting and overarching responsibility over the functions you may be needing, they're not necessarily the ones that are going to be doing the work. So it's very, very important to use all of your senses and to be able to go face to face and talk to them and get a sense of how they communicate, how open they are, because you can sense those things from this kind of conversation, right?
We've got about 10 minutes left. I know I put you guys on the spot and said you're going to open up to any examples. Do we have any questions for the panel on anything we've spoken about? There's a question over here. Oh,
Well, it sounds like,
and we'll come back to this gentleman afterwards. Please.
have you found that forming relationships with your contractors and providers has been helpful? And learning their expectations, their deliverables, and timelines can reduce, errors. We found that, by dealing with companies that, failed inspections, did poor jobs with cleaning clean rooms, and failure to report, adverse events on time, from CROs. What we found in our experience is we've been able to alleviate the performances. We realized this was a non-conformance. We spoke to all the people involved. We developed a relationship with them, and we got them to a point where they were able to take ownership of the problem, and correct their non-conformances and stay in communication with us. We also didn't wait, for problems to wind up on our desks. We moved forward with them. Those experiences have been helpful. We've discussed this with a couple of other forums today. That's an approach that I'd encourage others to use. As the panel used open communication and continuous communication with your contractors as a means to foster relationships and reduce errors by communication failures.
Anybody care to pick up on that?
I don't think anybody would disagree with what you just said. The thing that I would also add to it, though, is what you're pointing towards are elements of the culture of a company. And you need to be able to, again, assess the culture of the company the best way you can in interactions before you sign on the dotted line. The attributes that I tend to look towards is how, whether a company has a continual improvement program, right? Whether they're a continually improving kind of organization, whether or not the CEO is walking the walk or not. Because, again, a lot of the culture of the company is started from the senior leadership. So if the senior leadership is acting a certain way, you can probably guess that the rest of the company is following that way. So, so those are my 2 cents to add to what you just said.
In terms of relationship building, whenever I visit a company, I always ask to see the senior executive, at least at the site, or if not, the one overseeing the site, if it's a big organization. And I like to try and forge a relationship with them, not an intimate one, but I need the ability to just pick up the phone to a senior person. I'm not going to pick up the phone and yell at them. I want to be able to pick up the phone and say, we have a problem and I need to discuss it with you, because you need the ability to escalate, and sometimes formal escalation processes can be tortuous, but I always like to know somebody senior that I could just pick up the phone to and say, can we talk, because we've got a problem between our teams or whatever. Anyone else?
There was a guy with a question, I think.
Gentleman over here. Thanks, Trish.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak on this today. My question is really regarding, our firm is a clinical development consulting firm that supports clients that are using CDMOs as their end users. So our clients are the end users of a lot of these services. The question I have is kind of centered around how do you manage turnover within a CDMO that you may have contracted for your study? If the project manager that you had a chance to have your SMEs interview and they fell in love with and they really had a good communication with, all of a sudden they leave. I know there's nuances to it whenever you deal with it, but how do you manage ahead of time knowing that that's a possibility, that you may lose a project manager that you're working with and there may be some turnover within your contracting organization and you want to be able to keep the continuity going?
Who would like to pick up that one first? Who's experienced loss of a project manager at a CDMO?
Everybody.
Padma, you got to talk about that one?
Sure. So what we've typically done in the past is try to discuss, have a relationship with the current team and emphasize communication. I think Trish and Dan and Akasha all mentioned communication being important. So obviously if there's a turnover in staffing, turnover in project team members, understanding when that could happen, and even I've had some good experiences where the CDMOs will actually bring that transition person during that transition period and introduce that new project manager or business development person to us so that we are familiarized with that person before the other person were to leave or take a different role. So in some cases, you can anticipate when that change is going to happen. In certain cases where it's been a drastic change, we've actually had good communication or emphasized that our team communicate to us if there is any drastic change so there are no surprises in the end.
I think it's part of the CMO selection process too, because CMOs that have had loyal workforce where a bunch of people have been there for a really long time, that they tend to get people out of school and they stay for years and years, are much better to work with than the ones where they've got a revolving door and they're constantly changing their people every couple of years. So, as you select in CMOs, that's definitely one of the criteria that you look for is how long people have been there and whether they appear to be happy or not. Which is why it's good to take them out to dinner, because you can find out at dinner if they're happy or not after a little bit of lubrication.
So you should pick a CMO in a very remote location where there is nothing else. And therefore people are trapped and they can't, no, I'm just kidding. You're always gonna have turnover.
Yeah.
Whether it's people leaving the company, which is one thing you gotta look at, but also good people get promoted and they move up. So one technique I've seen at a CMO that I really like is they build in redundancy, not just in the functions that make up the team, but they build in redundancy for program management. And they do this in a clever way where you have a program manager, but you also have a project technical lead. And the two of them run the program meeting, and the two of them are almost interchangeable. It's just one has more of a technical focus and the other has more of a logistical based focus. But they can both run the program just as well. They're both intimate with all of the information and the lines of communication and the Gantt chart and the deliverables and the everything, such that I can do that, because quite frankly, the program manager may go on vacation too. And you can't stop your program because an individual is gone. So being proactive and building that type of structural redundancy where you can, because that means you need to have more than one person. But in this way, it's not two program managers, right?
And I've also seen it where they haven't had the program manager and the deputy or whatever they're called, but some of the technical team are so up on the program itself that any one of them can lead the meeting and make sure that the PM is capable. But the other side to that is I was working, as I mentioned, for Patheon, and we were working with one huge pharma, and they turned over 3 project managers in a year, and then we had a project manager leave us. And there was no forgiveness for our project manager changing, but we were expected to just accept that their PMs were changing. By the way, every time there was a change in PM, we lost efficiency because we just lost the communication. So it does seem to be a bit of a one-way street between the customer and the supplier, where in many cases, the customer just is unforgiving of somebody as apparently crucial as the PM leaving. But as Dan said, if there is redundancy built in, then that's not a bad thing. If the PM is the only person who understands the intricacies of their organization, then that is a bad thing. One last question, if anyone has one. Oh, lady just over there.
Hi, actually, I don't have a question. I just have a comment in response to the question about the project managers and your comment, Dan, about building in redundancy and making sure that, you know, there are different positions where there's someone that can fill in when someone's out. And I'm actually with, I'm with Avid Bioservices. I'm the VP of Business Operations. And I...
we just, apparently that's not the company that upset Trish.
Yeah, exactly. I was hoping I was
Tracy,
not
I had to
familiar
take
with
the
your,
joke.
your company name. So one of the things that I've put in place with my project management team is that we do have a primary and a secondary or a backup PM that supports each project. So the backup PM may not come to every call, but that person is very up to date and can fill in or step in when their primary is not available. And you know, there are lots of things that happen. People go out for paternity leave, maternity leave, vacations, and it really helps us provide that continuity. So we seem to like that at Avid.
Thank you. Perhaps we'd like to thank our panel.